Picture the smallest man in your unit. The guy who got teased about his height, who had to get his uniform tailored, who stood in the front row of every formation photograph. Now picture someone handing him a flashlight and a pistol, pointing at a hole in the ground roughly the size of a large suitcase, and telling him to climb in. The hole goes down about 4 feet, then turns. He can't see what's around the corner. He can't stand up. He can barely turn around. Whatever is waiting for him in the darkness could be a dead end, a cache of weapons, a sleeping enemy soldier, a venomous snake that was placed there specifically to kill him, or a flooded U-bend designed to drown him before he even realizes the water is rising. Now here's the statistic that most people never hear when they talk about the legendary tunnel rats of Vietnam. 1 in 3 of them was either killed or wounded before their tour was over. Not 1 in 10, not 1 in 20, 1 in 3. The average infantry casualty rate in Vietnam was brutal by any modern standard, somewhere around 15%. The tunnel rats nearly doubled it. And yet somehow, the official record of military recognition for these men amounts to 5 military medals and a single military cross across the entire conflict. Today, we're going to go into the hole. We're going to talk about what was actually waiting down there, what killed these men, who they were, and why the legend of the tunnel rat, the romanticized image of the small, fearless volunteer descending into darkness with nothing but guts and a .38, has almost completely obscured the systematic institutional failures and extraordinary human suffering that defined what was arguably the most psychologically brutal assignment in the entire Vietnam War. Because the story is much darker than most people realize. To understand how bad this was, you first have to understand why anyone thought it was a good idea. The Cu Chi Tunnel Complex in South Vietnam was not a guerrilla hideout. It was a city. By the time American and Australian forces fully grasped what they were dealing with, in the mid-1960s, the Viet Cong had constructed somewhere between 150 and 200 miles of interconnected tunnels beneath the jungle floor of the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, roughly 40 miles northwest of Saigon. This was not a recent construction project. Some sections dated back to the resistance against French colonial occupation in the 1940s. The Viet Cong had been digging, improving, reinforcing, and expanding this system for 2 decades before the first American boots hit the ground at Da Nang. The tunnels were not just escape routes. They were fully functional military infrastructure. There were hospitals down there, kitchens, armories, meeting rooms, sleeping quarters, printing presses for propaganda materials. The Viet Cong could move troops, supplies, and command communications under the feet of American fire bases without ever appearing on the surface. They could attack, melt into the jungle, and disappear underground before a reaction force could even organize. General Westmoreland's search and destroy operations were, in a very literal sense, punching at shadows. Something had to change, and what changed was that someone looked at the holes and decided men had to go in. The early approach was not glamorous. The first soldiers sent to investigate tunnel entrances in 1966 were not specially trained. They were simply the smallest men available, because the tunnels averaged about 2.5 feet wide and 3 feet tall. If you were above 5 feet 5 inches, you were physically too large to navigate the deeper sections. The Army did not build a doctrine first and find the men second. They found the smallest men available and shoved them into the ground. What emerged from this improvised beginning was something that genuinely captured the military imagination and has held it ever since. The tunnel rats became, in the lore of Vietnam, the ultimate expression of individual courage. Volunteer only. Tiny, wiry men who would crawl into the underworld armed with little more than a pistol, a flashlight, and, according to the legend, absolutely no fear. Their unofficial motto, coined with that particular dark humor that combat soldiers develop as a survival mechanism, was non gratis anus rodentum, not worth a rat's ass. They wore it like a badge of honor. The reality, as we are about to discuss, was considerably more complicated. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the legend begins to fall apart. The Australian 1st Field Squadron, the unit most thoroughly documented in terms of tunnel rat casualties, fielded a maximum of 120 men at any one time across their entire Vietnam deployment. From 1965 to 1972, approximately 700 soldiers served in this unit in total. At the end of the conflict, the accounting was 36 killed and 200 wounded. Just pause for a moment and let that sink in. 236 casualties out of 700 men. That is 33.7%. For every 3 men who served, 1 was either killed or came home with wounds serious enough to be counted. This is not the casualty rate of a dangerous job. This is the casualty rate of a catastrophic one. But here is where the first counterintuitive revelation appears, the one that most people who romanticize the tunnel rats never hear. Most of them did not die in the tunnels. The image of the tunnel rat meeting his end in some pitch-black underground chamber, facing a Viet Cong soldier in a space too small to properly aim a weapon, is viscerally compelling. It happened, but it was not the primary killer. The primary killers were mines and booby traps, and most of them were encountered above ground, during the approach to tunnel entrances, during area clearing operations, and during extraction. The Viet Cong were not passive defenders waiting underground for someone to come find them. Once they understood what the tunnel rats were doing, and they understood it quickly, they adapted their tunnel defenses in specific response to the tactic. They mapped where the rats would have to crawl. They designed traps sized for small men moving slowly on their hands and knees. The very qualities that made a man eligible to be a tunnel rat, small stature, and the ability to move through confined spaces, were the qualities the enemy designed their countermeasures around. Inside the tunnels themselves, the threats were layered in a way that was almost elegant in its cruelty. The first problem was darkness. A flashlight solves the problem of visibility for the man carrying it, but it also solves the problem of target acquisition for anyone waiting in the tunnel ahead. The rats learned to move with the flashlight held to one side of their body, angled forward, trying to separate the light source from the most vital areas of their torso. It helped. It was not a solution. The second problem was snakes. And before you dismiss this as a minor inconvenience, understand that the Viet Cong specifically used snakes as defensive weapons. Bamboo pit vipers, locally called two-step snakes, because the folklore, only partially accurate, held that you died before you could take 3 steps after being bitten, were found in tunnel sections that showed no other signs of recent Viet Cong occupation. They were placed there, deliberately. In the dark, moving slowly on hands and knees, you often did not see the snake until it moved. And in a tunnel 2.5 feet wide, there was nowhere to go. The third problem was water traps. The Viet Cong engineered U-bend sections into the tunnel network, passages that dipped below ground level, filled with water, and then rose again on the other side. These served 2 purposes. First, they blocked the movement of tear gas and smoke grenades along the tunnel, since gas would pool in the low section rather than flowing through. Second, they were death traps for a man who did not know they were there. If you crawled headfirst into a flooded section in complete darkness, your forward momentum could carry you into the water before your brain fully registered what was happening. The tunnel behind you was not wide enough to back up quickly. The flooded section was specifically designed to be just long enough that a man could not hold his breath to the other side. You did not drown quickly in a situation like that. You drowned slowly, in the dark, alone, with your body partially blocking the passage so the man behind you could not easily reach you. The fourth problem was gas. The Viet Cong discovered early that American forces would sometimes pump CS gas or other agents into tunnel entrances to flush defenders. So they adapted by pumping their own agents, including in documented cases partially burned materials that created toxic atmospheres, into sections where rats were operating. The closed environment of the tunnel system meant that gas had nowhere to dissipate. Concentrations built rapidly. And then there was what happened to Corporal Bob Botel. Bob Botel was 184 centimeters tall, 6 feet 1 inch. By every official standard, he should never have been a tunnel rat. He was nearly 8 inches above the informal height limit. But Botel volunteered, and in 1967, on his 4th day of tunnel operations, he went into the ground with his unit. He never came back out alive. The official finding was asphyxiation. Botel's body, significantly larger than the men the tunnels were designed to be navigated by, had blocked airflow in a particularly narrow section of the tunnel. The already thin atmosphere of the underground passage became depleted of oxygen. He lost consciousness. By the time his colleagues realized he was in trouble and attempted to retrieve him, it was too late. He was killed not by the enemy, not by a booby trap, not by a snake. He was killed by the simple physics of being too large for the space he'd volunteered to enter. And the institution that sent him in had no effective screening beyond an informal size preference that was casually overridden. He was not the only man lost to the tunnels in this way. Sapper Bob O'Connor, who survived his time as a tunnel rat and later attempted to articulate what the experience was, offered what may be the most honest summary anyone has ever provided of what it felt like to do this job. "You've got to believe," he said, "and I mean really believe, that you're already dead." This was not hyperbole. This was functional psychology. The tunnel rat who descended believing he was going to survive, who thought about his family, his future, the beer he was going to drink when this was over, was a tunnel rat who hesitated. Hesitation in a 3-foot-wide underground passage, face to face with a tripwire or a waiting enemy, was a death sentence. The men who figured out how to do this job figured out how to metabolize fear by converting it into something else. They told themselves they were already gone. Everything after that was extra. Harold Roper, another survivor, described his first tunnel descent in terms that strip away every romanticized notion of the fearless volunteer. "I felt more fear," he said, "than I've ever come close to feeling before or since. Not during ambushes above ground, not in firefights, not during the moments anyone would recognize as conventionally terrifying. In the tunnel, in the dark, moving forward on his hands and knees into absolute uncertainty. He went anyway. They all went anyway." But let's be very clear about what volunteering meant in this context. The tunnel rats were volunteers in the formal sense. No one was ordered to do this work, but they were operating in an environment where someone had to go in, where refusing meant your smaller colleagues took on additional risk, where unit cohesion and the particular social dynamics of combat made volunteering feel considerably less optional than the word implies. They were brave. That's not the question. The question is whether the institution that sent them in had done everything possible to give them a fighting chance, and the answer to that question is considerably less flattering. One of the most remarkable documented encounters in tunnel rat history involves Nelson Ritter, who was working through a section of the Cu Chi complex when his flashlight illuminated, at a range of perhaps 4 feet, the face of a Viet Cong soldier doing exactly what Ritter was doing, moving through the tunnel in the dark, armed, focused, and almost certainly just as terrified as the man he was now staring at. For a moment, neither man moved. Then, by what seems to be mutual unspoken agreement, both of them backed away. Neither fired. Neither could explain it fully afterward. The tunnel was too narrow to maneuver properly. Shooting in a stone and dirt enclosure with no ear protection and no room to brace for recoil was dangerous for both men. The geometry of the situation was simply too catastrophic for either of them to pull a trigger. Ritter backed out of the tunnel. The Viet Cong soldier presumably did the same from the other direction. Whether they ever encountered each other again, on the surface or underground, is not recorded. This is the kind of story that gets turned into movie material. What does not get turned into movie material is the institutional context surrounding it. Let us talk about what the men were given to do this job. The standard equipment for a tunnel rat operation was one pistol, typically a .38 caliber revolver or a .45 semi-automatic, one flashlight, and a knife. That was it. The tunnel was too narrow for a rifle. Grenade usage was severely restricted because the confined space made fragmentation equally dangerous to the user. Shotguns were experimented with and largely abandoned because the blast in an enclosed tunnel was as dangerous to the shooter's hearing and orientation as to any target. The suppressed high-standard .22 pistol was adopted in some units specifically because a standard caliber gunshot in a tunnel could temporarily deafen and disorient the shooter. Let me put that another way. The Army identified that firing a pistol in a tunnel was so disorienting that it developed and fielded a specialized weapon to reduce this problem, and then failed to adequately distribute that weapon to the men doing tunnel work. The standard solution remained the standard issue sidearm, the one that would temporarily destroy the user's hearing and spatial orientation in the enclosed space. No body armor was issued for tunnel operations because the available body armor of the era was too bulky to fit through the passages. No breathing apparatus was issued for sections where gas or oxygen depletion might be a risk, because no practical apparatus existed that could be worn while crawling through a 2-foot-wide passage. The men wore whatever they wore above ground, minus anything that made them too large to fit. Consider the awards record. The Australian contingent, 700 men, 33% casualty rate, operating in some of the most documented tunnel systems of the entire war, received 5 military medals and 1 military cross for tunnel operations across the entire conflict. 5 and 1. The awards were, in the language Australian veterans would later use with considerable bitterness, rationed. There was an unofficial policy that kept the number of high-value decorations below a threshold that might have drawn attention to exactly how dangerous this work was and exactly how many men were being lost doing it. Recognition, you see, creates obligation. Obligation to provide better equipment. Obligation to develop proper doctrine. Obligation to acknowledge that the men being sent into the holes deserved more than a pistol and a flashlight, and the informal institutional blessing of being called elite. The early documented survival rates for tunnel rat operations, before the work became even slightly systematized, were genuinely catastrophic. Some assessments of the initial operations in 1966 and early 1967 put survival rates for full tours at roughly 3%. 3%. The rationale for continuing to send men into the ground under these conditions was not that the work had become safer. It was that the intelligence value was considered worth the cost, and the men being expended were volunteers. And volunteers in wartime do not stop volunteering just because the casualty rates are horrifying. There is a particular type of institutional failure that is different from simple incompetence. It is the failure that happens when an organization knows something is killing its people, has the data to prove it, and continues the practice because the alternative, acknowledging the true cost and restructuring accordingly, is more expensive and more complicated than continuing to accept the losses. The Tunnel Rat program across its history demonstrates this pattern with uncomfortable clarity. The tunnel rats of Vietnam didn't stop being tunnel rats when they came home. Not psychologically, not in the way it matters. Post-traumatic stress disorder as a formal diagnosis did not exist in its current form until 1980, 6 years after American combat operations ended in Vietnam. The men who came back from the tunnels, the ones who came back, returned to a country that didn't particularly want to hear about Vietnam in general, and certainly didn't have the framework to process what tunnel rat service had done to their nervous system specifically. They had spent months in conditions of almost pure psychological extremity. Complete darkness, complete confinement. No advance information about what the next 3 feet of tunnel contained. The operational definition of a threat that could materialize from literally any direction at any moment, with no warning. The human nervous system is not designed to normalize that. The men who had normalized it, who had made it functional by convincing themselves they were already dead, now had to undo that normalization. Now had to relearn that the dark was not a threat, that a confined space did not require a weapon, that a sudden sound in a small room was not the precursor to a snake or a grenade or a face emerging from the darkness 4 feet away. Many of them couldn't. The clustering of tunnel rat veterans in the decades following the war, the survivor gatherings, the informal networks, the tendency to seek out other men who had done the same work, was not simply nostalgia. It was the particular solidarity of men who shared a specific type of damage that the people around them couldn't fully understand. The work itself did not end with Vietnam. The tactical problem of underground defensive networks did not disappear because America's involvement in Southeast Asia did. The Israeli Defense Forces developed their Samor unit, which takes its name from the Hebrew word for weasel, to address tunnel systems constructed by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and later by Hamas in Gaza. The tactical problems are identical: small men, confined spaces, darkness, and traps designed specifically for the men trying to clear them. The institutional lessons of Vietnam tunnel operations were, in some respects, better absorbed by the Israeli Defense Forces than by the American military that generated them. The Cu Chi tunnels themselves are now a tourist attraction. You can buy a ticket, descend into a widened and cleaned section of the original complex, and crouch in a tunnel for 30 seconds before emerging into daylight with a story to tell. The Vietnamese government has, with considerable entrepreneurial ingenuity, turned one of the most effective military obstacles in modern unconventional warfare history into a ticketed museum experience. There are still sections of the original complex that have not been cleared. Not because clearing was never attempted, but because the tunnel system, after decades, has partially collapsed, partially flooded, and partially filled with the accumulated organic material of half a century. The jungle does not distinguish between what was built to kill Americans and what was built for any other purpose. It reclaims all of it with equal indifference. The men who went into those tunnels are old now. The youngest of them are in their 70s. They gather when they can. They do not, by most accounts, talk extensively about what happened down there, even to each other. When they do talk, it is about the men who did not come out, the ones on the wrong side of that 33%. Here is what the legend of the tunnel rat gets right. The men who did this work were genuinely, documentably, extraordinary. The courage required to descend into a tunnel in the Cu Chi complex, knowing what might be waiting, knowing the casualty rates, and knowing that the flashlight in your hand was also a target indicator for anything waiting in the dark, was not the kind of courage that most people are asked to produce. It was courage under conditions that the human nervous system almost categorically refuses to accept as survivable. What the legend gets wrong is the framing. The tunnel rat, as lone hero, fearless and resourceful, descending where others could not go, allows us to sidestep questions that the actual history demands we ask. Why were these men given a pistol and a flashlight and told to handle it? Why were awards rationed in inverse proportion to the danger of the assignment? Why did the institution take years to develop even minimal doctrine for this type of operation? And why were the lessons so incompletely transmitted that armies are still working out the same problems 50 years later? Bob Bowtell was 6 feet 1 inch tall and volunteered to do a job that should have screened him out. He died on his 4th day because the institution could not tell him no effectively. 1 in 3 Australians who did this work were killed or wounded. The men who survived went home to a country with no framework to help them process what they had experienced. The official record of recognition for their service fits on half a page. That is not the story of a heroic special role. That is the story of extraordinary men failed by ordinary institutions, doing impossible work with inadequate tools and paying a price that the official history was, for a very long time, incentivized not to fully count. They were worth a great deal more than a rat's ass. The record just does not reflect it.